Welcome to our event to support Palestinian human rights defenders as the Jewish Sabbath comes to an end. It's good to look at our relationships of solidarity within our own communities and across the globe on Earth Day. As Fabina Cologne reminds us, to make a connection at the beginning of events between ourselves and the earth and the indigenous people who were on the land where we are. Today we're going to be, or tonight, connecting to another community on the other side of the earth, occupied Hebron, which the Palestinians called Al-Khalil. Both names refer to Abraham, or Ibrahim, being the friend of God. And here in Al-Khalil, or Hebron, the Palestinians are facing repression by the Israeli military and settlers who are making their lives so difficult that they will be forced to move off their land. At least that's the intention. Tonight we'll be focusing on Hebron and freeing Issa Amro, who is being prosecuted by the Israeli military court on 18 different counts for his work in Hebron with the Palestinian group Youth Against Settlements. And Issa also works with Israeli human rights activists and international solidarity activists too. The United States and Israel's policy have a profound effect on the Palestinians, including Issa and the Youth Against Settlements. The nonviolent resistance of the Palestinians and the actions of the Israeli settlers and military have opened the eyes of many international human rights activists, including those in our community. So are there people here who have been to Hebron, met Issa, or not, even if you didn't meet Issa? Would you please stand? So you get an idea of the scope of the influence in our even small area here. Thank you. My name is Beth Harris, and I'm an activist in Ithaca Jewish Voice for Peace in the Committee for Justice in Palestine, and these are the two groups that organize this event. And I'm also on the Jewish Voice for Peace National Board, and our organization as a whole has taken a stand in solidarity with Issa and Youth Against Settlements and their struggle for justice. 23 years ago, Israeli settler from Brooklyn, Dr. Baruch Goldstein, shot to death 29 boys, Palestinian boys and men, as they were knelt in prayer in the Ibrahimi Mosque. Afterwards, the settler movement in Hebron made a shrine in honor of Dr. Goldstein. And in addition, the Israeli government cordoned off Shuhada Street, shut down the Palestinian businesses, and prevented Palestinians from walking on this main street in their own town. After that massacre and the response of the Israeli government, I realized that as both a Jew and as an American, I had to know more about what was going on that led to this situation and to take a stand. Through my research, I realized this wasn't just an evil settler. Israel, in the 1967 war, conquered the West Bank and Gaza, and afterwards instituted military rule. And what this means is the laws that were created were by commanders. They're orders, military orders. And the judiciary which is a military court system, was created in order to enforce those orders. The judges in that court system also serve in the military. So in this kind of a situation, justice for Palestinians is impossible. There's no Palestinians that are making these laws. They're not in the courts. And there's no jurors of their peers. And so what this means is the human rights defenders have to make their stand in the streets. The courts aren't really a venue for rights. And in addition, in the prison cells, and in addition through international outreach for solidarity. In fact, Palestinian prisoners right now are on a hunger strike for just basic human rights. Visitors, competent health care, the right to have charges in court, and prison sentences not be held indefinitely, and just fundamentally the right to have prisons in the territories where they live. When Palestinians are sent to Israeli prisons, their relatives often cannot get permission. In fact, usually can't get permission to go into Israel and visit the prisons. What the Palestinians are doing here on hunger strike is they're making a self-sacrifice, which inflicts pain on themselves and their families. But the Israeli government considers this hunger strike an act of terror. And in this regard, they are being punished right now while they are within the prisons. Rabbi Brian is co-founder of Rabbis for Human Rights North America, and now he's co-chair of the Rabbinical Council of Jewish Voice for Peace, and he'll share his experiences in Hebron, Al-Khalil, and observations. Then Kirby Edmonds, Senior Fellow and Program Coordinator of the Dorothy Cotton Institute, will speak. Kirby was one of the organizers on a delegation that linked human rights for Palestinians and those within the United States, including the struggle for racial justice. He also went with a group of people who have been active in nonviolent social movements here in the United States and was looking at the relationship between that movement and the movement in Palestine. And our last speaker will be Ariel Gold, who is the CODEPINK campaign director and Youth Against Settlements and international advocacy director. She is going to give us an update of what's happening with Youth Against Settlements, with Issa's trial, and the solidarity that's happening there and around the world. As she'll also let you know how you can offer support.
So, when I heard that Issa Amro was arrested, I was shocked, heartbroken, and totally not surprised. I was heartbroken because Issa is fundamentally a kind, gentle, and brave man. I had met Issa. I had twice gone on trips with him through Hebron. He'd taken me around Hebron. He's a relentless, dedicated, nonviolent activist for justice. He works, as Beth explained, with Jewish groups, with Israeli groups, with international groups. He organizes Palestinians who oppose settlements. His very relationships with Israelis, Jews, internationals, envisions a kind of multi-ethnic state that may be possible in that land based on respect and equality. And he lives in Hebron and is dedicated to telling the truth about what's happening in his city. And I wasn't surprised that he was arrested for all the reasons that I've just said. Because in some ways, Issa is a much greater threat to the Israeli state than Palestinians who may engage in violence against the state, who are also a threat. But he's a much more dangerous threat in some way, because he's a nonviolent truth teller. He's a peace seeker. And you can imagine that peace is possible. How could you not imagine that peace is possible with someone so deeply committed to nonviolence? And nonviolent resistance to the violence of the Israeli state is much more threatening. So, and Beth already told us about Hebron, and I'm just going to cut to the chase and tell you about my experience of Hebron. As many of you know, and some of you don't know, I was a progressive Zionist for most of my life, until about now I'm getting close to a decade of transformation in that view. But till then, of the 65 years that I have been on this planet, 54 or 55 have been as a progressive Zionist. I was deeply connected to Israel. Deeply connected to Israel for two reasons, to Zionism. One was Israel and Zionism, in my mind there, offered security to Jews, a safe place for a marginalized and traumatized and victimized people, my people, and it offered security and safety for my people. And secondly, and equally importantly, it offered the possibility of the revival of Jewish culture, and in particular Jewish values, where Jews who had been victimized for many years in many different countries could create our own society, where we would create a society that was based upon the deepest teachings of our tradition of justice and compassion and peace, and also was a response to our own historical experience of victimization by creating a society that would never victimize another people. So what happened to me over time is that I realized that a lot of these perceptions of the Israeli state didn't bear out in reality. And the place where it really became the most intense for me was on a visit to Hebron. I had already seen home demolitions as being involved in Rabbis for Human Rights. I'd been in Palestinian homes that had been demolished. I had been to unrecognized Bedouin villages and Palestinian villages in Israel, which since 1948 haven't been connected to the electrical grid, to the educational system, to the water system, and so on. Specifically, and the same time, as lots of settlements and towns had been created for Jews, which were thriving and totally connected and provided with services while there were these unrecognized villages. I had met Palestinians who had applied for residency permits and had got a job and gone overseas for 6 months and had been denied residency in Israel. So I already had a profound sense that there were ways in which Israel wasn't fulfilling the vision that I had imagined. But at that point, I thought all those things are really sort of blots on the stream. They're like violations that don't go to the core of it. They're on the side, and we would fix them. We need to just fix them up. And my visit to Hebron disturbed that illusion. I went with Issa around Hebron through the Palestinian market and watching barbed wire above the market from which settlers would throw all kinds of disgusting things down on Palestinians down below. I saw disgusting graffiti, death to the Arabs, all over the area of the market. And I saw, in the way in which Beth described, the market had been cut in two, and Palestinians had been not allowed to have their full market in response to an act of extraordinary and disgusting and violence by a Jewish settler, Baruch Goldstein. Now, I went through Hebron not only with Issa. I went through Hebron in 2008 with Breaking the Silence and with two men, Yehuda Shaul and also Michael Manikin. These are people who worked closely with Issa, and because Hebron is now a divided city, what they would do is the Israelis would take us through the Jewish parts of Hebron, and then Issa, we'd cross the checkpoint to the Palestinian side. I mean, we're talking about like crossing State Street. It's like bizarre. And you would then cross to the other side, and you'd go through the Palestinian section with Issa, and then cross another checkpoint to come back to the Jewish side. Now, the reason that Hebron is divided is because there are, in the biggest city of Palestinians on the West Bank, the largest city of Palestinians on the West Bank, of about close to 250,000 or 220,000 Palestinian residents, there are 500 to 800 incredibly doctrinaire, ideological, and violent settlers, armed settlers, who are protected by the Israeli army, who have placed themselves right in the middle of this Palestinian city with the sole goal of reasserting Jewish primacy in that city and getting Palestinians to move out and making it hard for Palestinians to live there. So with one of these trips, which is the moment at which it changed for me, I was going with Michael Mannequin from Breaking the Silence, very brave. Breaking the Silence are soldiers who serve in the Israeli military. And we walked down, I like walking around, I'm sorry. We walked down Shuhada Street, which Beth talked about. The street and when we got onto the street, Michael said to us, this is a sterile street. That Israelis refer to this as Rehov Sterili. What is a sterile street? A sterile street is a street on which Palestinians do not walk. It's a street that's not contaminated by the walking of Palestinians. Now, as some of you know, I grew up in South Africa. The travesties and indignities and oppression and gross injustice of apartheid was immense. And there were many things that were just so unbelievable that I grew up with as a child. But truth to tell, there wasn't a sterile street. I'd never come across a sterile street. And all along, as I realized that there were policies by the State of Israel that privileged Jews over non-Jews, over Palestinians, I kept on thinking of South Africa because it seemed parallel to South Africa. But whenever I would mention the word apartheid, people would go ballistic in the Jewish community, and I would retreat and not say the word. At that moment, I felt I had crossed over, and that I was no longer going to back off from the word apartheid. Because although Israel is different from South Africa, the two political situations are different. The two countries are different. They're different population divides. There are all kinds of differences about them. They have one thing in common. They have it in common with this country as well, which is they have in common the sense that there's a systemic discrimination against a particular group of people based on their ethnic identity or their race or their national origin. And that in international law, not because it's like South Africa, but in international law is defined as being an apartheid, the crime of apartheid. And in that sense, Israel was definitely guilty of apartheid in terms of international law. For me as a Jew, that was untenable. Everything about Judaism is contradicted by apartheid. Everything about Jewish experience is contradicted by apartheid. And as a Jew, I felt I needed to speak out and to say clearly that this violates the deepest truths of my own tradition, even though it's done in the name of the tradition and presumably in the name of the Jewish people. I needed to say that and to speak truth to power. Now, of course, truth-telling in the Palestinian community, if you're a Palestinian, is very dangerous, right? That's why Issa's being arrested. But the truth is that truth-telling in the Jewish community is also dangerous. Not as dangerous as for a Palestinian, because no one's going to get killed, no one's going to get put in prison, but it's also dangerous. And why is it dangerous? Because there is a large, organized, well-funded organizations in this country of many different kinds whose express purpose is to silence not only Issa, which the Israeli government, of course, takes into its own hands, but to silence anyone who speaks about Palestinian rights. And so anyone who speaks about Palestinian rights, and those of you who know about even this, whatever it's, what do we say? It's 10 miles surrounded by reality. Even in these 10 miles surrounded by reality, if you're a Palestinian who comes and wants to speak in Ithaca, you will face enormous resistance from various quarters that will try to prevent you from speaking in Ithaca. So the idea of silence, I want to end with this. There's a massive effort to silence. What's happening to Issa is to silence him by putting him in prison because he's telling the truth. And truth-telling is also being silenced here in Ithaca and in America in general. And I think that the task that we have is to gain inspiration, to be inspired by this man and his courage, and for us to tell the truth, to insist on telling the truth, because telling the truth is the only way that will set us free, and telling the truth is the only way that the oppression of the Palestinian people will be ended, because this silencing network is a network that essentially is about the goal of continuing the oppression of the Palestinian people. And as a people who are dedicated to the fact that there should be equality, basic equality and dignity for all people, we need to tell the truth about that, to be courageous in telling the truth about that and refusing to be silenced. Thanks.
Well, good evening. It says here I'm supposed to talk about the relationship between the nonviolent resistance movement in Hebron and the Palestinian grassroots and U.S. struggles for racial justice and human rights. And I'm supposed to do that in now 8 to 9 minutes. So I just want to start by asking you to imagine. You can close your eyes or not, and it shouldn't be too hard for you all to imagine this. So you got this 3-story house with a basement, and you're running a business out of the living room, and things are fine. You got lots of people living there with you, your cousins and your grandparents, and a lot of kids running around. And one day the police knock on your door, and they come in, and they say, we're shutting down your business in your living room, and you have to move to the basement. You're all now going to be in the basement because we got these other people that are going to live on the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd floor of your house. And some of them leave, but a lot of them stay. It's just so that you don't bother the people now living on the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd floor of your house. And so the question I have for you is, how would you feel and what would you do? All right, just sit with that for a little bit. How would you feel and what would you do? So what I've just described is settler colonialism that cannot occur without state-sponsored violence, which is one of the reasons why the international community says it's illegal. It also cannot occur without the intention to violate human rights, to actually prevent democratic process from occurring. It cannot occur without the intention to steal people's land, and it often cannot occur without killing people. Now, the connection to this place where we live is that where we live is one of the most successful experiments in settler colonialism there's ever been on the planet. It's not the only one, so there's lots of places, but essentially in this place, people think settler colonialism is a grand idea. We have holidays celebrating it. And I'm not kidding. So to understand the experience of people around the planet who are trying to figure out how to deal with how they feel about it and trying to figure out how to deal with the tremendous violence they face, it is, what's the word I want? it exacerbates the set of contradictions of living in a place that says that it cares about democracy and is founded on completely anti-democratic practice. Now, that's very problematic for people to wrap their minds around and try to figure out how to behave. But it's not hard to understand why, in the context of a human rights framework, we would agree across the planet that settler colonialism is probably a bad idea. Rabbi Brian already talked about apartheid. The other piece of what, and this is the connection to what's here, is in order for people who, the folks who now live on the first, second, and third floor to feel okay about what's going on, is they have to understand that there's something wrong with those people living in the basement. And that, in fact, the presence of the police to keep those people in the basement is a good idea and necessary and right. And it's certainly legal. And so one of the things that goes on in the context of making this system work is the criminalization of a group of people. And that's the connection to the place we live in, which has this very long history of criminalizing people for being Chinese, or being Japanese, or being black, or being brown, or now being Muslim, and defining that in completely legal terms, which confuses people who believe in law and order. So, now, when I was on the West Bank, I did not run into any Palestinians who seemed to be confused. But I run into a lot of people in the US who seem to be confused about how to understand our circumstance. And I run into a lot of people who are unclear about what's to be done in the face of state-sponsored violence. I don't have an answer to that question. What I know over time, what I've observed, is that nonviolent resistance has its place, it often works, and it's often the only thing that people have in the face of the tremendous state violence that they face. However, it takes tremendous courage to stand up, it takes tremendous courage to speak, and it takes tremendous resilience to continue to just exist. So those are the connections that I see. I see a lot of people standing up, being courageous, and continuing to exist, which is often the most successful thing people can do in the face of settler colonialism. So I think about this place and where we started with Beth talking about this being Cayuga land, and I'm struck by the fact that there's 400 Cayugas living in Tompkins County of 100,000 people. And I'm struck by the implications of such a successful project undertaken for a variety of economic reasons, and not every day, but frequently I ask myself the question, what does it mean to live here? What does it mean to know these things, to stay here, and to live with integrity? So those are the things that come up for me, and I just leave you with that. And so the connection to Issa is he's a person who is extremely brave in standing up to what is going on.
Most of you know that I work very closely with Issa, and that for the past few years, I have spent significant time staying in the West Bank, and for the past couple of years, staying in Hebron with Youth Against Settlements and working on a daily basis with Issa. and Rabbi Brian, who I am blessed to have be my rabbi, spoke about how Shabbat is about putting down the flame and a day of rest, and about bringing back the prophet Elijah. And in Hebron, Shabbat is a day of violence, of extreme hatred and violence and ugliness. The settlers in Hebron, they teach that to their children, and they carry it out. So an average Shabbat in Hebron, you can sit on the street and watch teenage boys, younger than my son, carry giant machine guns into synagogue, because that is Shabbat for them. And on Shabbat in Hebron, the settlers come, or they send their children, young children, they've trained their children. They come and they take over the yard of Palestinian homes and carry out acts of violence. And they take over the yard of Youth Against Settlements on most Saturdays. For a number of months now, they've been coming on Saturdays and taking over the yard. They say very, very ugly things that I won't repeat. And in this case, it's children who are sent there to do that by the adults. Maybe you have 5-year-olds and 12-year-olds, and they get in circles, and they say very ugly and vulgar language that's inappropriate, and I won't repeat. And they throw rocks at women and at children, and they try to kick the children, the Palestinian children. And the soldiers come, and the soldiers protect them. The soldiers come, and they surround them, and they make sure that those settler children are safe to carry out their acts of violence on Shabbat. And I discovered this sitting with Issa, and I would go down because I'm a mother and I'm also a social worker, and I thought, well, these children need a little bit of, suggestion and redirection. And so I went down to try to, let them know, like, no, we're not going to be violent. That's not okay. And I quickly learned that this was way beyond my skill set. So that's Hebron. And if you live in Hebron as a Palestinian, those are the conditions that you live under. And those are the conditions that families live under. And the reason that settlers behave like that is because their whole primary goal is to drive the Palestinians out of the city. And it's a very, very difficult life for families in the old city of Hebron. And what Issa does is he provides support and protection, and he gives resiliency to the families living there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about who he is, just a little brief history. Issa is an electrical engineer by day. This is a man who wakes up at early in the morning, like most of us do, and goes to work. For a regular work day, he does project management in Hebron. And then immediately from work, he works until midnight, 1 in the morning, as an activist. He often has 3 phones with him, all at the same time, and he's on all of them organizing. Organizing for help for a family that's being attacked by settlers, organizing for the next nonviolent protest, organizing to bring Jewish Israelis in to work together. Whatever it is, it's happening. He got involved in nonviolent activism during university. He was studying, and he was a very, as he tells it, a very dedicated student. He studied day and night, and it was the second Intifada, and the army shut down the university. And he was horrified that this was his life. And he ended up organizing for the students there to use nonviolence, sit in the school. They took over the schools, they took over the streets, and they reopened their school. And as he tells it, he fell in love with nonviolence. So Issa gives tours and meetings with diplomats from around the world, often from Europe, from the US, members of our Congress, groups that go there to meet him. As we saw before, many people here have met him. He works day and night, so if you come to Hebron, you will likely take a tour with him. He also trains the youth in Hebron in nonviolence, in the effectiveness of nonviolence, in the history of nonviolence, in the study of it, and in how to carry it out strategically. I want to speak a moment here to this bottom picture that you see on the screen. So in February, I was there for the annual Open Shuhada Street campaign, and I will speak about exactly what Open Shuhada Street campaign is in a moment. But once a year, Palestinians try to enter the sterile street, the closed street. And I was there on this particular occasion with a delegation from Veterans for Peace who happened to be in the West Bank at the same time as me. And so we were all marching in a march to try to enter the sterile street. And this is what you encounter, just a mass of soldiers who, as we marched, and hand in hand, and we came up to these soldiers maybe 20 feet away, no further than the end of the room by far. And we're all arm in arm, and they're all there with their very large guns. And we all raised our hands, very clearly, like we are unarmed. And they raised their weapons, in this case tear gas canisters and stun grenades, and aimed at our heads and opened fire. And this is just one piece of the bravery that it takes to work in Hebron and to work daily in Hebron. You live in a place where when you encounter the army and you raise your hands, they raise their guns and aim at your head. So some of the projects that Issa works on, as I said, he gives hope and resilience and strength to the community, include on this sterile street, there are 20 checkpoints in Hebron. And you have to go through checkpoints to get onto that sterile street, Shuhada Street. But Palestinian families still live there. There are a number of families that still live there. They have to go through a checkpoint and say their number. You might be in the checkpoint for hours. Every time you want to go buy milk, that's life. So the Palestinian families on that street, a number of them were not sending their children to kindergarten because you would have to send your young child through the checkpoint to go to kindergarten. And I don't have a picture here of these checkpoints, but they look like, they were remodeled last year, and they look like the front entrance to a maximum security prison. They are horrible, horrible places. So families were not sending their children to kindergarten because who wants to send their 5-year-old through a massive maximum security prison entrance so that they can get on their way to school, where they're likely going to be tear gassed on their way to school. So Issa worked with a couple of other groups to open a kindergarten in the area so that families did not have to send their children there. They had to smuggle the toys in over cover of darkness in the night because the military would not let them bring the toys into the kindergarten. They opened a little late because it was difficult they had to smuggle all the supplies to build the kindergarten. So they opened a little late and 30 families enrolled their children. So they also have volunteer days. Issa organizes volunteer days because if you live in H2, it's called, which is the closed area, or in Shuhada Street, the sterile street, you usually can't get repair people into your homes because a repair person knows that if they go to Shuhada Street, they're going to have to go through the checkpoint, and they might be detained for 3 hours. They might be detained for 6 hours. They might be arrested. This is reality of what it takes to get into these areas. And so a home repair specialist, they say, sorry, I hear that your refrigerator's broken, but I'm just not going to go. So around once a month, Issa organizes for groups of individuals to go to these homes and bring their skill sets with them. So Issa is an electrical engineer. He does electrical work in the homes. Somebody else does masonry. They build the homes. Last year, when the whole area was declared a closed military zone for 6 months, which means that literally nobody can enter. You cannot get into that area unless you live there and you've been assigned a number. So you certainly cannot get a new appliance and a repair person, nothing. You can't get an ambulance. Never can an ambulance drive there. You have to carry the person. But in this case, you can't even bring a doctor in to carry the patient out when it's a closed military zone. So during this time, under cover of night, in the middle of the night, Youth Against Settlements puts a refrigerator on their back for a family and carries it in, and then carries the old one out. So this is what they do, and this is what they offer to the community. Currently, they're involved in building a cinema to bring life and infrastructure to the community. I spoke about them giving tours, and sometimes you get some rather famous people. So we have here a picture of Richard Gere. This was fairly recently. So the picture on the left that you see here, this is working on the cinema, and this took place last May. when hundreds of Jewish Americans came in from the West Bank and joined Israeli Jews to go into Hebron to clean, it's an abandoned Palestinian factory in the closed area where they're building the cinema. And there were massive arrests for the attempt of cleaning. So Issa is one of the most creative individuals with nonviolence. And nonviolence is not simply passivity, it's action, it's strategy and action to achieve your goals. And so just a few of the things that have been done when we had a closed military zone there last year for 6 months, they staged a sit-in with a tent, and that's the upper right-hand picture, outside of the Shuhada Street checkpoint entrance, and people lived under that tent in the middle of the winter. Down below, just while I was there this past time, we had an action throwing shoes at Donald Trump, and an image of Donald Trump, which made international and American news. As shoes in Arab culture, throwing your shoe at somebody is a sign of disrespect. And Donald Trump does not deserve the respect of the Palestinians for many reasons. I won't start. And so we talked about this being a sterile street, right? This is a street where Palestinians cannot drive, where you can't get on. If you're not Palestinian, you can't get onto the street, where all the shops have been closed and boarded up and sealed shut by order of the military. And so recently, and this is also while I was there, under Issa's guidance, we reopened a vegetable market on Shuhada Street. So we brought carts of vegetables onto the street, in the middle of the street, cauliflower, and stood there on the street. Cauliflower for sale, Shuhada Street Market is open, come get your vegetables. And you see people, these Palestinian families, and they start looking out their windows like, oh my God, what is happening on my street that I have gates and wire in front of because settlers throw things at my family? And we lasted about 15 minutes before the military was there, and it was soon a closed military zone. So, as I said, once a year, they have an annual campaign. It's called Open Shuhada Street. I would ask that next year Ithaca join the campaign. So in 1994, as Beth spoke about, Baruch Goldstein entered the Ibrahimi Mosque and opened fire inside the mosque, killing 29 Palestinians in worship and injuring 125 more. Essentially, since then, though there have been some progressions, it was exacerbated in 2001. Shuhada, the city was divided into H1 and H2 under Palestinian Authority control and under Israeli military authority control, and the street was sterilized. And it has remained that way and gotten worse and worse ever since. They also divided the mosque to create a synagogue there. And it's life under checkpoints is dreadful. So last time I'm there, and I'm with Issa, and he's giving a tour to two people from California, and we're walking through from the Palestinian marketplace towards Shuhada Street, where he would leave. I was with him because, as Rabbi Brian said, you have to have an international or an Israeli to then enter Shuhada Street to finish that part of the tour. So I was accompanying, and I was going to take them onto Shuhada Street. So we passed the first checkpoint by the mosque, and for no particular reason at all, the Israeli military says to him, "Let's see your papers," and he gives them his papers. And we spent the next hour and 10 minutes there with Issa standing at the end of a gun, while they pointed a gun at him, detaining him, gun pointed at him, me filming. Crowds of there was an American group that was there to visit the synagogue and sort of to see both sides of the story, and they stood there to watch and as though this was a play or an act rather than somebody's life, rather than the life you spend at the end of a gun. So we talked about, the dangers of getting shot at, of being detained, but then we have the real danger for Issa, which is success. And success, the result of this success becoming stronger and stronger, is that Israel has brought back 18 charges against him, dating back to 2010. So Issa has been arrested hundreds of times in his life. I can't count the number of times. He can't tell me the number of times. Many, many times. When somebody is being harassed, he goes in front of them. He usually ends up in jail. After Open Shuhada Street, so here we are again, this is Open Shuhada Street. After Open Shuhada Street and you're being tear gassed, he's often arrested for being accused of planning the demonstration, anything they like. So hundreds of arrests. He has never until now been indicted or convicted. But he's become a greater and greater threat. And so they have brought back these 18 charges since 2010. The charges consist of such things as organizing an illegal demonstration, demonstrating without a permit, being in a closed military zone. One of the charges is for insulting a soldier. He hurt a soldier's feelings. And literally, when you read the indictment, it says, he hurt the soldier's feelings. So we all laugh, and Issa is facing years in prison. One of the charges, a certain settler, David Wilder, accuses him of punching him or breaking his camera. I forget which he was accused of. During that time, so many of these charges have been previously investigated. They're all the way back to 2010. So during that time, the Israeli military investigated the charge and found that Issa was already arrested and detained in a cell after having been beaten by the military, while he's now accused of assaulting a settler. But in Israeli military court, Issa has no credibility. No Palestinian has credibility. And Israeli settlers and Israeli soldiers tell the story. And the conviction rate is 99.7%. That's the conviction rate. So he had his first court date in December, and I'm proud to say we had representatives of the US that attended, from the US consulate in Tel Aviv, or embassy in Tel Aviv, excuse me. We had representatives from the UK, from the EU, from Germany, across the world. Representatives came to stand witness at his trial. On that date, and Issa has an incredible lawyer, she's an Israeli civil rights attorney, she requested that 14 of the 18 charges be dropped against him on the basis that these charges were old and in many cases had previously been investigated and the cases had been closed. So this past February, we finally received a decision on those 14 charges, and the decision from the judge was that none of the 14 charges, not a single one of the 14 charges would be either dropped or reduced. And the reason for that was that Issa continues his activities. The judge said, we will not drop these charges because this man continues his nonviolent human rights activities. And so we're going forth with the 18 charges. His next court date is July 4th. On this date, there are 38 witnesses against him. They consist of settlers and soldiers. On this date, 9 of the 38 witnesses will testify. I am planning on traveling there to be there as well in person. Issa has incredible international recognition and support. In 2010, he was declared by the UN Human Rights Council, I think it is, Human Rights Defender of the Year. He has been a guest of the US State Department as part of their International Visitor Leadership Program. The EU has recognized him as a human rights defender and recently reinforced that recognition. Amnesty International has released multiple urgent appeals for his case and said that if convicted, he will be declared a prisoner of conscience. This past March, the US State Department, and this is quite a shocking thing for the State Department, included Issa in their report on human rights in Israel and Palestine in 2016. We've also had a number of members of Congress who have spoken up for Issa, who have contacted the State Department, and we're working with others. And I can give more details on which members of Congress we're working with and what we're doing in Congress. And especially in one of the asks I will make is anybody who has any connections to members of Congress or prominent individuals, prominent writers for this, because we've had a number of op-eds already in prominent papers, including the New York Times. Please let me know, and we will talk about how to use those opportunities. So we also have a massive coalition. Beth spoke about Jewish Voice for Peace being a very large supporter of Issa, and they are also annually join the Open Shuhada Street campaign. as well as CODEPINK and American Muslims for Palestine, the U.S. Palestinian Community Network, and others. This is freeissa.org, and I encourage you to go and sign the petition if you haven't yet. The petition is hosted by a laundry list of organizations, including the ones that I just mentioned, the National Lawyers Guild as well, Amnesty International, a number of organizations from Europe, from South Africa, Israeli organizations, Rabbis for Human Rights, and on and on and on. Again, it's freeissa.org. Please go there. And so lastly, what you can do to help. So we have the petition at freeissa.org. If you are interested in writing an op-ed, either here in Ithaca or wherever you think that would be useful or have specific connections to members of Congress or to anyone who's sort of a prominent individual. So I want to, as I ask for donations, I want to go back a little bit to what Rabbi Brian spoke about truth-telling, right? So Issa is a truth-teller, right? And he is being persecuted for being a truth-teller, for telling the truth and standing up to tell the truth. So the next project that we're going to be working on is a truth-telling project. So when you go around Hebron, amid the horrific things you see, the sterile streets and the soldiers everywhere and the giant machine guns and the tanks, you also see all these signs that have been put up that change the names of the streets, and they change the story of what happened. So these signs say this has always been Jewish land, and they stole it from us, and thank God we have it back, and this is so wonderful and wonderful. And I see Brian nodding, and I see Beth nodding, because people are familiar with these signs. So we've also had signs where the names of the streets are closed, and this is throughout the H2, the area under Israeli military control, which is also the neighborhood of Tal Rameda. So we have these signs that are non-truthful signs that tell this story that this is Jewish land, and Jewish land only, and that Jews will be coming back to take the land. And in fact, the US organization that funds 40% of the funding for the settlers in Hebron, this is called the Hebron Fund, and it is based in Brooklyn. So the Hebron Fund is in fact having two parties next month, one in the city of Hebron and one in Washington, D.C., to celebrate 50 years of Jews reclaiming the land of Hebron and a promise that they will take the whole land, come violence as it already is. So, and that is where 40% of the funding for the settlements in Hebron comes from. It comes from the Hebron Fund. So, and they put up these, they help, that's what funds these signs of untruth telling. So the next project that we're going to be doing is we're going to be putting up new signs around Hebron. And when you put up a sign, something in Hebron, or you raise a Palestinian flag, which we did in February, that we raised a Palestinian flag there, it's a tricky thing to do because these settlers are very, very violent, and they're very, very protected by the army. So it has to be very, very sturdy. So this is not a fun little cardboard sign like we would put up here in Ithaca. You need metal, and you need concrete, and you need professional sign making. So we need funds to purchase the signs that we will be installing throughout Hebron. So as I ask for donations, and I'm not asking for donations for Issa's legal case, that is being covered by Human Rights Defenders Fund, which is an Israeli organization that assists in legal cases for human rights offenders who are under attack, because Issa is he's far from the only human rights defender who is under attack. The 18 charges are new. Bringing up 18 previous charges is a new attack, and he's likely not to be the only one, but he is the first of that. But he is far from the only one under attack. So Human Rights Defenders Fund is taking care of that. But the work, as we all know, right, who work in social justice, we don't do it. It costs money, right? It costs money. We need supplies. We need our sign-making supplies. We have to have meetings. We have to pay our Wi-Fi bills, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to ask you to dig in your pockets and to give generously to support Issa's work. And his work will go on whether or not he's in prison. We don't expect him to go into prison on July 4th, just so people know. But as I said, he trains youth. He trains the next group. And I hear him often saying to young people, sometimes as young as 16, or younger, you have to be able to do this without me. You have to be able to do this without me. I don't know if I will live. Nobody knows, this is Hebron, really. People are shot there regularly. I don't know if I will live, and I don't know if I will be free. You have to be able to carry on this work. So whether or not he is imprisoned or not, the work goes on.
I'm a U.S. vet, and the descriptions that I heard of the soldiers, the only thing that kept running through my mind was cowardice and how I had no idea that this was actually going on. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't that terrorism? Mixed with old Jim Crow-ish, sort of like institutionalizational, like, well, someone like me just gets really angry because of that, and so, anyways, I'm kind of shocked, actually.
One of the things that I didn't say that relates to that is that in order to make this kind of oppression work, individuals and the state have to be very adept at population control and find a variety of means by which to control both what people say, how they move, where they can move, and how they can basically conduct their day-to-day lives. And one of the things that I often say to people is that for folks who live in the United States, particularly for people who are non-white, it is extremely important to pay attention to what's happening on the West Bank and Gaza, because that is probably one of the most successful experiments in population control going on the planet right now, both in terms of small neighborhood control and large land area control when you think about Gaza, the blockade, and the invasions. And I think a lot about what it means to think about controlling populations here in the United States, particularly in the cities, larger cities. It's not all that difficult to do. If I think about Manhattan, you only have to control 4 bridges. And the U.S. military is extremely connected to the Israeli military in thinking about and studying mechanisms for population control. And that's one of the biggest connections to trying to understand what's happening there as information about what can happen here. Just saying.
I wanted to just add to that is that there is shared training between police. Police officers and leaders are sent to Israel to get trained in these techniques. And so there is that tight relationship. And Jewish Voice for Peace nationally has just started a campaign to oppose what's it called? Deadly exchanges, and to end these deadly exchanges. And we have some flyers on the back table about it.
NYPD has an office in Israel.
Absolutely.
Say that again, Kirby?
That the the New York Police Department has an office in, I think it's in Tel Aviv.
Wow. So I thank you all for sharing, and I just wanted to add a footnote that when I did live in Hebron myself for a month and a half, and I was working with the Christian peacemaker teams, we were working, trying to keep an orphanage open. I shared this with another group about a month ago, and I was saying how the apartment that we were renting was in the old city, and we had to enter in through this door, and I was doing that for a month and a half. And then finally, like the day I was leaving, I was brought up onto the roof, and I found out that the front door of the building was Shuhada Street. I had no idea. But I did know that right at the end, we lived on a dead-end street, but the dead end was filled with, the big barbed wire and then huge blocks of cement. And so all the people within the building, and the buildings are all interwoven, interconnected, as is the city of Jerusalem. The city is 6,000 years old. I mean, that's where Abraham and Sarah are told to be buried, and that's why they call it the Ibrahimic Mosque. So it was a shock for me to go on the roof and not only realize that Shuhada Street was right there, which Beth and I had gone to march with Breaking the Silence, the Israeli soldiers that had come out to speak about the atrocities that they had participated in. But the other thing that I could see from the roof was this compound where the soldiers were located, which were brought in there to protect this small population of people. So that was a shock to me. Anyway, because I couldn't access it.
I also just want to say one thing here that I should have said earlier, and that's I don't want you to read this as part of the silencing and so on, but I do want to say that, you know, I serve here in Ithaca as the rabbi of Congregation Tikkun V'Or, and I want it clear that tonight I'm not speaking in the name of my congregation. My congregation has a commitment to justice, to peace, and to equality for Israelis and Palestinians, but we have different views in our congregation about how to get there, and my view is just one of them. There's some congregants who agree with it, some who don't, but what we're united about is about having an open conversation about it and honoring that we have difference about it.
I was just interested in the members of Congress who are allies.
Sure. Absolutely. So Representative Pocan has spoken out, and we are in talks with Representative Pocan about initiating a Dear Colleague letter, and we should know more about that next week. Representative Cartwright from Pennsylvania is also very supportive. Representative Hank Johnson. We've also had meetings with Bernie Sanders' office, and we are hopeful that he will take a position. And a number of other offices, I can give you a more detailed list. Those are the ones that are in the top of my head, but I can give you more of them. Not Representative Reed locally, which we didn't really have hopes for.
I wonder why.
And not Senator Schumer. We also did not have high hopes for. But I can give you a more detailed list of who we've been in contact with so far and the specific, what we're specifically working on. I think also Skakowski. Yeah, I can give you the rest of that.
Thanks to our sponsoring organizations, which in addition to Ithaca JVP and CJP are CODEPINK and the Syracuse chapter of JVP. The goals or the mission of our group is to support a just and lasting peace for Israelis and Palestinians based on human rights, equality, and international law.